We are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again is Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, as you all know, is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is an economist and economic historian, and so much more. And his latest book is The Sickness is the System. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Thank you, RJ. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And, I was off for a week. I took a vacation up in the Adirondacks, and that's more or less where I'm from. I was born and raised in Utica, New York, which is a Rust Belt town that has, like so many Rust Belt towns, fallen upon hard times. You probably can't see my shirt, which my brother gave me. It was also my birthday while I was away. It says Utica versus everyone. Because the attitude we were raised in Utica was a little bit of, the hell with all of yous, But obviously that's not solidarity as we seek to pursue it. But my Utica made me think about something I'd love to talk to you about, which is the state of the Rust Belt, the state of post-industrial America. I don't know how many towns like Utica you visited, but they say that 50%, half the building stock is now abandoned. There are places that look like Mad Max wasteland, just acres upon acres of empty factories, empty houses. The house I was born in is abandoned and falling down and so on. And yet Utica is also unique because it is one of 5 refugee resettlement centers in the United States. So if and I plan to go back there and write about it again, but I guess, what I wanted to talk to you about, maybe as a way of setting it up in terms of the Rust Belt, is I almost never hear about it discussed politically anymore, unless it's as a battleground state, as if the way it voted was the only thing that mattered about it, or unless it's with magical thinking to me, notions of magical new jobs. Everybody in towns like Utica will become a programmer or something. But I don't hear anything in the way of a coherent plan to reinvigorate or revitalize industrial America. Is it just dead and gone for good? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me begin by saying that you and I have more in common than I had understood. I was born in a place called Youngstown, Ohio. And I could say literally word for word about that place what you just told us about Utica. And it would be pretty accurate. Youngstown was once part of what was called the Steel Belt in those days. It was a place that produced various kinds of steel that go into other kinds of products and so on. My father worked in a place called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, and those are 2 forms in which steel is produced and sold. So I'm acutely aware. Let me answer your question this way, and I'm going to be blunt because it has to be that way for it to be comprehensible. We allow, as a society, a tiny group of people, employers, together less than 1% of the population of this country, to make decisions about where to locate production based on what is privately profitable for each of them to do. So if they go to Utica, it's because they foresee a profit by locating there. And when the time comes, if and when they see better profit prospects someplace else, they are free. That's part of what free enterprise means. They are free to close the business in Utica and move, for example, to Shanghai in China, or to Mexico City, or wherever they can be allowed to enter. The social costs of their decision to relocate are not their problem. In other words, if they fire 10,000 people who all of them, can't make their mortgages or disrupt the lives of their children because they have to leave the schools that they've become comfortable in, all of those kinds of things, that's no concern of the company that chooses to relocate. They don't have to compensate their workers for all these losses. They don't have to compensate the larger community, which of course loses out if you fire thousands of people from a place like Youngstown or Utica or Detroit or Camden, New Jersey, or the hundreds of other towns in this country that tell the same story. All of those people just lose. There is no responsibility for the company that makes the decision to leave to cope with the social disaster it leaves behind. That's the fundamental problem in this society. It is not a democratic decision. The vast majority of people affected by a corporate decision to move have no say over that decision. The corporate leadership, the board of directors, the major shareholders, they have no responsibility, no accountability. This is an exercise in the social consequences of a fundamentally undemocratic economic system. There's no nice way to sugarcoat that, although I do bow my head to my colleagues in the economics profession because they have sure tried to sugarcoat their way around this dilemma. But the reality of Utica and the reality of Youngstown and countless other cities are a living witness to the reality that I've just tried to summarize. And I think, we teach students in economics something called cost-benefit analysis. And it goes something like this. Everything is either a net benefit or a net cost. If you think about hiring someone, if you think about buying another truck for your business, if you think about extending a wing on a hospital, you're supposed to go through this exercise in which you list and measure all the quote unquote positive consequences of such an investment or such a decision. And you look at the number and you measure the cost of all the negative consequences. If the positive outweigh the negative, that's a sign you should make the decision, build that wing, hire that person, relocate somewhere else. And if the negatives outweigh the positives, that's your sign, don't do that. Go look for something else where the positive will maximally outweigh the negative. Here's the problem. When corporations follow this advice, they are not required by law or by regulation to count, let alone to measure, but even to list or count all of the negative social consequences that flow from their decision to move. And therefore, they come up with lovely say, look, we're going to make this kind of money if we move to China. We pay half the wages or a quarter of the wages. We don't have to obey this, that, and the other law that we have here in the United States. It's wonderful. We're going to make more money. Therefore, we're going. And in our strange culture, this kind of logic, we're all nodding there, even though it has ripped off the United States on a scale that's horrible. If you actually counted all the negative consequences of factories and offices moving, you might very well come up with a negative much larger than the positive. But we'll never know because we don't require it. And therefore, companies leave when it's profitable, and behind they leave a mess. And let me add one thing. The prime example that I use to teach this is the city of Detroit, which deserves a primacy because it has been so important in American history, the center of our automobile industry. In the 1970s, presidents of the United States would take visitors from other countries prime ministers and everything, and take them to Detroit. And there they would showcase Detroit. Look at this, all these Ford, General Motors, Chrysler factories humming. Look at all these workers. Look at the wages they get. Look at the fact that there's a significant number of them that are African Americans, giving those folks an opportunity they mostly did not have elsewhere at that time. Look at it, look at it, look at it. Population of Detroit, 1970, just shy 2 million people. Now, fast forward now. We're talking 50 years later. Detroit's fortunes are a downline that never stops going down. The population of Detroit now is around 700,000 people. In other words, over 50 years, significantly more than half the people left the city of Detroit because there were no jobs, there were no stores open anymore, houses were being abandoned, they were falling down, they were catching fire, it was dangerous everywhere. The stories are, I could go on, everybody knows. But here's what I want to stress. We as a nation watched for 50 years, that's half a century, we watched this process, not just in Detroit, but in many, many other cities. Cleveland, literally the same story. My hometown, Youngstown, again, I could go on. And nothing was done that succeeded. Lots of hype about this program and that every politician is going to turn it around. It's like presidents. The last 8 presidents we've had have promised to bring back manufacturing to America. Every one of them promised, none of them ever delivered. So that you can be sure that Mr. Biden, if he's the candidate, and whoever the Republican, will be promising to do it all again, standing before the cameras at a factory where some foreign entity is going to invest money, never following up to discover that the foreign entity found a better place to do it and kissed everybody goodbye, often after getting subsidies from the local governmental authorities. It is a despicable criticism of capitalism. To allow that is unspeakable. And it means, not to preempt where you're going with it, RJ, but it means if you don't address that basic structural reality, you're not going to solve these. Capitalism is driven by profit. That's the holy grail. That's the bottom line. That's what we're in business for. And if you let that continue, that system built around that logic, then they're going to come and they're going to go. And we're going to see a world in which every country is warring with every other countries to bring them, the corporations, to their part of the woods rather than another. And nobody cares about the social consequences of the factories leaving. The decisions are made in elegant hotel suites where representatives of the government that wants you to come cuts a deal with the corporate board of directors, and everybody goes out to a very expensive dinner right afterwards.
No, absolutely. And before we leave the topic of Detroit, Richard Wolff, I do want to mention that in late 60s, I would guess 68 or so, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Smokey Robinson recorded a song called I Care About Detroit that began with this little monologue. I looked it up while we were talking. He says, there are many reasons why one cares about a city, why you care about its problems, its people, and indeed its very future. Is it friendly, warm, hospitable? Are there good opportunities, educational facilities, and a cultural center? Are you proud to call it your hometown? When you come right down to it, I'll bet you'll all agree to a resounding yes when you're talking about Detroit. Now, Smokey could record that song in the belief that the post-industrial, post-World War II growth we were seeing guaranteed a secure future for Detroit. For Detroit, he could indulge in some boosterism, what have you. Maybe the Chamber of Commerce asked him to record it. I don't know, but whatever it was, those words just are bitter and ironic now because they suggest we were all soul, R&B stars and regular working people alike, living in a shared delusion about what the future was going to be.
And that never stops. I mean, I could sit down with you now and I could show you 100 promotional videos, movies, theater pieces, articles, editorials, op-eds, telling us, for example, that the high-tech telecommunications giants of Silicon Valley, they are the sort of future, and the United States is going to be as dominant, and just like it was said about cars. It's unbelievable. You can sell that dead horse as if it's going to take you into tomorrow, and you can apparently do it over and over again to the same people who seem not have understood when a few industries tell you how wonderful everything is. You should be reaching for your wallet to hold on to it because someone else is about to reach in there and take everything you have. Silicon Valley can look as desolate. You can travel to San Jose, California, which is the center of it, and you can see the future desolation when capitalism has found another place or another product in which to make money. That's the way the system works. The United States was the beneficiary particularly after we became independent in 1776, and we fought that second war with Britain to break from the empire in 1812. The rest of that century was an explosion of profitability here, which is why the 19th century and maybe even the first part of the 20th was a time of economic growth. That's when Detroit went from a tiny town that nobody cared about into the colossus of American capitalism. But it would be naive not to understand that, like the ball that goes up, it comes down. Capitalism is exactly that way. Profit went elsewhere. One of the places it went was to the People's Republic of China, which is now producing more cars than we are. Even General Motors produces more cars in China than it produces here. They've kissed the United States goodbye. They have abandoned the United States. And the only really interesting question is, why do the American people permit themselves to be abused in this way? And there's no solution for the Rust Belt unless that fact is confronted.
Well, if that fact is confronted, let's assume, and you and I have both agreed in previous conversations that we see hope for the future. If we agree that at some point a new politics will take place, a new movement will take place, what would be, before I introduce something unique to Utica, what would be the kind of thing that people should be calling for? If it's possible to revitalize places like Youngstown and Utica, what would people, clearly, the capitalist model, the corporate model has failed these places, devastated these places. I think of those big flying saucers in Independence Day who come to a planet and suck all the resources out and move on to the next one. But what would a politics look like or a movement look like that could bring something to these places?
Well, my answer, again, it's a long conversation, but my brief answer would be this. If you want an economic system that serves the people first, not a small 1% of the employer class, and maybe the 5% that invest in what those employers do, but if you want a society that is genuinely democratic when it thinks about economics, then the first thing you'd have to do is develop the standards, the goals, the desirable things that a revived economy will do, starting with reviving itself. And the second thing you'll have to do is organize the decision-making process so it isn't focused on profit anymore. It understands itself to be a superior or a better way to organize. And so you have objectives like a good housing stock, a real quality transportation system, a first-rate education structure. Those are the things you're going to do. And you're not going to have much use for the profiteering managers because no fault of their own. They've spent their entire life in that system. Very hard to ask people to step out of it. Some may, but I wouldn't put my hope there. And I would change the structure of the enterprises to make it really sink in. And by that I mean, and you know where I'm coming from, I would organize the new industries to build the new economy in a different way as worker co-ops, because that brings in the large community. The majority of people are employees. They should be in charge. The employer should be the employees themselves. And every decision, every major decision, not the small details, but the major decisions, including where we locate production, should be made by the workers as a collective in a democratic vote, and by the local community, the residential community, which should likewise have a democratic vote. And you have to have both of them agree for any major shift. Look, if you want the economy to serve the people, you got to put the people in charge. And I have just given you a way to do that. And if you focus them, then you could have Detroit spend the next 10 years rebuilding Detroit. There are loads of things to be done to its educational system, to its transportation system, to its housing stock. You all know, we all know, loads of work to be done. Let's get on with it. And if we had a supportive state and federal government to provide the financing, well, then we would be in a way able to develop a rapid economic growth program. And you know who did that in the last 25 years better than anybody else? The People's Republic of China. You may not like it. You may have criticisms of it. I do. But to fake it and not make it by pretending to yourself you don't have to learn anything from anybody else, which seems the Washington mantra, that's not going to get us any better in the next 50 years than poor Detroit got in the last 50.
So let me introduce another variable into the conversation that's somewhat unique to Utica, which is, like some of the other cities you mentioned, enormous population shrinkage. First, air conditioning meant that the textile mills could move south. Globalization took care of the rest of it. There was one point where I think the house I was born in is falling down. The one I spent more time in, you could have bought it at one point for probably $10,000 or less. There was just a lot of virtually free housing or abandoned housing in the U.S., which led it to become a refugee resettlement center. So the current population of Utica is about 60,000 people, of whom about 17,000 are resettled immigrants and about 43,000 roughly remaining, simplistically put, of the 102,000 that were there when I left. So you have this large refugee population there from Cambodia, from Bosnia. The church on Main Street is a mosque now, from Vietnam, from a number of places. And now they're expectantly waiting for the Ukrainian refugees to arrive. And that to me raises another interesting question, which is, I heard a Republican politician the other day say abortion was terrible because it robbed this country of 72 million people or something who could have been born and become workers. To which my attitude is, if you think the economy needs 72 million more people, I'll bet you could get them from somewhere else in the world. You wouldn't have to, produce them through reproduction. But I was just reading up on the studies of what refugee resettlement has done for Utica, but is and I don't think it's conclusive yet. I've seen some things, but I think generally it's beneficial. And I wonder if where immigration might fit in a much more progressive approach to immigration in strengthening some of these hurting parts of the United States.
Well, again, it's always the same issue. And I hate to sound like the proverbial broken record, but on the other hand, I mean, if I'm going to be honest, I have to tell it to you. Immigration always presents one basic issue. You are taking people who come from a different ethnicity, a different geography, a different religion, a different education, a different family structure, different mentality, and all of the rest. And you're bringing them here into the United States. Okay, if you don't take the steps to make these people able to live in a decent way with a secure job and a decent home life in the family, if you don't do that, you are going to ghettoize these people sooner or later, and mostly it's quite sooner. So in order to really accommodate immigrants, in order to avoid the disruptive hostility to immigration that we all know about, and the ghettoization that so often happens and has been happening right up to this moment, then you have to give the immigrants what we can't give in this country, which is jobs, good jobs right away, learning while doing, with whatever supports are necessary. Yeah, if you did that, then you could, but we don't do that. What we do is we say to the immigrant, you're lucky to get in, now good luck to you. And where do they end up? At the bottom of the food chain of employment. The worst jobs, the worst salaries, the least benefits. So what does that mean? Well, they can only afford to live in the bad part of town, which doesn't get any better. And their children have a hard time because there's very little supports to help them integrate. In effect, we create multiple societies in very unequal circumstances, and that is a recipe for disaster. So if you're asking me, I'd love to see immigrants come in. Let's create a whole sector of the economy based on worker co-ops and invite the immigrants to be the worker co-ops of the future. Give them the loans, give them the supports, buy X percent of what the government buys from worker co-ops as a commitment to develop it, and let them be unique in a way that doesn't deprive them of income and jobs and all the basics of a life in this society. Well, the United States has never done that. Never done that. It's left everybody on my parents were immigrants. My father was French. My mother was German. They came to the United States to escape World War II, and they came with nothing. And they had to fight and they had to struggle, and they suffered. They really suffered. And they had two children, one of which is me, and we had to go through a lot of difficulties that were unnecessary, that made it harder when it wasn't appropriate and wasn't necessary. But because everybody is focused on profit, nobody is focused on the larger social issues. And even if they are, they have to bow down to profit before they do anything. You're hamstrung. You can't get the job done. And this is not an argument. I can show you the history. You just gave it to us for Utica. I gave it briefly for Youngstown. We talked about Detroit. The evidence is all around us that a profit-driven private capitalist system, whatever its strengths and weaknesses, dealing with the problem of jobs disappearing is not a strength of this system. It's a horrific deficit.
And I've sometimes wondered whether some of the resistance to immigration in this country, well, much of it, as we know, is racist, but I would argue that racism is encouraged by employers and others who prefer, the kind of control over the system they have now. I don't know where this fits into it, but for example, my grandparents were immigrants. And my grandfather came here, became a tailor, was a union organizer. And, you know, you hear about these immigrant socialists. Well, yeah, he was. And I just, in New York City, like so many people, you know, of that, great generation were. And I just wonder to what extent, but then you hear conservatives talking about, well, we've got to cut Social Security and Medicare because the worker ratio is going to get so low, 3 active workers for 1 retired person instead of 12 or what have you. And then I think, well, then great, let's bring in other workers. I mean, if you really want more workers, let's bring in other workers and create the job market that they'll want to be part of, that they'll be willing to move for. But obviously they don't want to do that. So isn't the anti-immigration piece, I mean, obviously I understand how the current system makes life hell for immigrants, but isn't some of the resistance to immigration a kind of divide and conquer strategy?
Yeah, that's always part of it. But I think what's governing now is the fact that having done very little for immigrants in the way of a special accommodation to make them fit in and feel accepted, and to do away with the hostility. If my job isn't threatened, if my housing isn't threatened, if my children's education isn't threatened, then I'm not threatened by immigrants. There's nothing intrinsic about an immigrant. We've all come from immigrants, and, you know, since we slaughtered the people who were here when the Europeans came. So the reality is it could be a non-issue, but it can be seized upon. Working class people who are insecure in their jobs for whatever reason may be persuaded in a particular conjuncture, like now in the U.S., that their problem isn't an economy that has no place for them, but it is the immigrants that somehow want to take away what. Once you allow, again, this kind of mentality to govern, you have the kind of absurdity that I can close with for today. We are now talking, and we have been for 6 or 7 years, about, or maybe only 4 or 5 years, a labor shortage. Hello, we spent the previous 10 years with Obama, Bush, Trump, and now Biden expelling millions of workers from this country. And now we are scratching our heads and we must do something about it. And nobody seems to be able to say, you brought this on yourself. You made a political decision to reject, to deport, to stop at the border, all the things, you know, the ICE Bureau and all the rest of it. And now you're seeing the results. I mean, any fool could have told you that given the Social Security, the demographics, given the world economy, if you do what you do and you're a mature, older society, quite like Japan or Western Europe, you're going to run short of labor pretty soon, Jack. And you might want to think about what is going on. But no, we have come up with the 2 worst mechanisms of solving our problems: expelling immigrants and refusing to allow abortion, so that we could populate this country with native, non-immigrant children born to parents who either couldn't or didn't want to care for them. This is not a recipe for economic success in the future. This is a massive program of shooting yourself in the foot.
And I know you have to go, but I'm still scratching my head that we have a labor shortage. And yet I thought economists thought when you had a shortage of something, you paid more for it. But
that's right. There are always the important exceptions.
Yeah, apparently.
When an employer has to pay more, there's always lots of argument about why that shouldn't happen.
Right. Well, Richard Wolff, as always, thank you so much for your insights. And as always, thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure. My pleasure, really, RJ. These are important conversations to have.
Thank you. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.